Well, my clock says it's straight up 12 noon. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Fourth State Dairy Nutrition and Management Conference webinar series. It continues today featuring Dr. Paul Kononoff, Dairy Nutrition Extension Specialist with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, discussing feeding alfalfa to dairy cows. The Fourth State Dairy Nutrition and Management Conference presents the latest research on nutrition and management of dairy cattle and has expanded the conference impact on the industry with the webinar series. The conference and webinars are a collaborative effort of Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, University of Illinois Extension, University of Minnesota Extension, and the University of Wisconsin Extension. Please click on the evaluation in the chat box. It's short and your input helps us to improve future programs. This presentation will review current research on how alfalfa compares with other forage sources and its effect on dry matter intake, fiber digestibility, and dairy cow performance. It will cover key nutritional characteristics of alfalfa and how these factors influence rumen function and milk production. The session will also address practical ration formulation strategies and emerging approaches to enhance intake, efficiency, and profitability in modern dairy feeding systems. Dr. Kononoff grew up in California and studied at the University of Saskatchewan, and then in 1998 attended Penn State University and eventually earned his PhD in animal science with an emphasis on animal nutrition. Upon completion of his PhD, he worked in the dairy industry by serving as a technical support specialist, then as project director at the University of New Hampshire. Since 2005, he has been employed with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln with an appointment of research and extension. He has had several major research areas, including forage quality, feed characterization with application to nutrition models, and energy metabolism. Many will recognize him as the past editor of the Journal of Dairy Science. As I always say, Dr. Kononoff, the podium is yours.
Hey, thank you, Fred. I'll jump in, but don't hesitate, Fred, if for some reason it's hard to hear me, just interrupt and tell me to speak up. Thank you for the nice introduction. There's one correction I need to make. You said that I grew up in California. I actually grew up in Canada, in Saskatchewan, where I just looked at the weather where I grew up in Saskatoon. It's 12 degrees today, and so I don't think they see a lot of that weather in California. But thank you very much for the invitation to talk about forage with the group today. For those of us that have gray hair, we know that alfalfa is just an incredibly good forage. I'm just going to minimize my screen here. Been around for a long time. This is a nice article written actually in 2001 that shares some of the virtues of alfalfa, calling it Queen of Forages. Really is the oldest forage crop that we have a name for. The early French called it the healthy hay, and it is an excellent animal feed. But it also, we know that it improves soil health, and as a result can increase the yield of other crops. It's even been used for human food and medication. I'm obviously not going to get into that. But despite the existence of fertilizer, it continues to be a really important crop. And I think many of us know that. Sometimes it's easy to forget. And I think over the last 20 years, we have started to forget about alfalfa. And so this, talk, what I want to do is just share some of the value, what alfalfa brings, and then maybe some of the situations around it. How do we feed it? What are some nutritional choices and understandings that we need to have when we are feeding alfalfa, because it really does fit. And I think we do ourselves a disfavor when we make recommendations to dairy producers that are also growing their own forages to grow less alfalfa, because I think it really does fit well into the whole food production system. So what I'd like to do is just take one step back and look at the chemical composition of alfalfa hay and compare it to some other forages. So what I have listed here in this slide is some common chemical composition of basically feeds that we look at. What I have listed here are some nutrient concentrations and requirements, essentially, for lactating cows. But what I've got listed here is alfalfa, a common forage, certainly in some places of the country, orchard grass, and then corn silage. And so if you go right to the bottom of this table, you'll see listed metabolizable energy or digestible energy. And so alfalfa maybe lags a little bit behind orchard grass, and certainly doesn't compete in terms of energy per unit or per kilogram of corn silage. And I think this is a big reason why we're growing more corn silage, is just because of all the energy that it supplies. But the reality is it can actually contain quite a bit of energy. One of the things that I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on is just the nature of that fiber that's found not only in alfalfa, but compare and contrast it specifically to orchard grass. And so one of the things that you'll see here is the ADF content and the NDF content of both alfalfa and orchard grass. And what you'll see is orchard grass tends to have typically a higher NDF content and maybe a little bit higher ADF content. But we can estimate the hemicellulose content of forages by taking NDF and subtracting out the ADF content. And this is one area that orchard grass actually stands out to typically being higher than alfalfa. And so that's obviously fiber, but the type of fiber actually does differ in alfalfa compared to orchard grass. If we just look at NDF digestibilities, these are book values, so we know there's many agronomic and environmental reasons why NDF digestibility would differ. But these data were taken from the Dairy NASEM, and NDF at 48 hours is about 53% for both of these forages. Obviously, corn silage, where that stands out, where a lot of that energy is coming, is from the starch. And in the case of alfalfa and orchard grass, it's quite low in starch. Okay, so if we just took alfalfa and we compared it to orchard grass, I pulled out this old study that was actually conducted at Ohio State University. And what the investigators did is they took a group of cows and they harvested alfalfa hay and orchard grass. And in fact, I think these were both silages. Yeah, they were both silages. And they included them in the diets of 40% of the diet dry matter, 60% of the diet dry matter, and then 80% of the diet dry matter. And so alfalfa is in green, and then orchard grass is in black. And so what you'll see, and this is kind of a typical response when you feed increasing amounts of forages, you can see that both of those forages, dry matter intake decreased when you increase the proportion of forage. Now, what about the differences between these two forages? What you'll see is that dry matter intake for orchard grass is actually lower than alfalfa. Again, this is kind of the textbook picture when we think about feeding these two forages. These are often the responses that we see. And I will talk a little later about why this occurs. So you've already seen, this should not be, So I've already talked about dry matter intake. This is the intake of NDF of either alfalfa or orchard grass. Obviously, in both cases, as you increase the proportion of that diet, the intake of of NDF increases. Okay, and so the diet NDF content increases in the case of more so for orchard grass than it does for alfalfa, but both forages increase together. What about NDF digestibility? Actually, NDF digestibility across these concentrations, so as you increase these two forages, the digestibility of alfalfa really didn't change, and the digestibility of orchard grass didn't really change. But actually, you can see the digestibility of orchard grass was actually higher. So I think this is really important to understand. You may say, okay, and then if we just take the step back to milk yield, actually statistically there was no difference in milk yield. Okay, so we've got something that's kind of peculiar here. We see a difference in NDF digestibility, but nothing shows up in milk yield. And keep in mind, a big reason for that is because the orchard grass resulted in lower dry matter intake. Okay, so cows seem to consume more alfalfa, even though the NDF digestibility was a little lower, and milk production was the same. So what's going on here? Mike Allen and his graduate student in 2012 published this really neat study. They stated exactly what we just saw. In general, cows consuming grasses have lower dry matter intake. But what they state, and is exactly what they saw in that study, is many studies that test these two forages actually are confounded by the concentration of NDF. And so what they wanted to do is to take NDF concentration out of the factor and just compare these two forages. I'll probably talk about it a little later, but one of the things probably a big difference between these two forages is actually just the rigidity of these two forages. I think everybody knows that alfalfa, certainly as a hay, but even as a silage, is actually the particles can break down and shatter a little more rapidly than if you take an orchard grass. And so the rigidity of these forage particles for these two forages is actually quite different. And this is something that Mike Allen was interested in looking at. He called the term fragility and suggested that alfalfa particles are more fragile than orchard grass particles, and then said, well, what's the effect of this fragility on the cows? So this is just the chemical composition of the two forages that he fed. As you would expect, alfalfa was higher in crude protein, but the NDF content between these two forages a little closer together. They weren't identical. You can see the NDF content of orchard grass is 58, and then the NDF content is of the alfalfa is 42. The lignin content of the alfalfa was a little higher. And then he measured the in vitro NDF digestibility. And on the alfalfa silage that he was feeding, it was actually lower than the orchard. So these were the diets that he fed. He fed two diets and compared them when he actually fed them to cows. And so the alfalfa silage he included at 60% of the diet dry matter. The orchard grass went in at 43% of the diet dry matter, fairly similar in corn. And I should make sure everybody understands these are percent of diet dry matter. Okay. Because orchard grass is lower in protein, he added a little bit more expeller soybean meal and then urea. So when you do all of this, this is the chemical composition of these diets. Crude protein, maybe a little higher on the alfalfa diet, 18.4 versus 17. The NDF content of these diets were almost identical, 29 versus 30%. The amount of forage NDF of these two was also identical. Okay. Indigestible NDF, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail a little later. But if you look at the amount of total indigestible NDF, it stayed in the rumen essentially for forever. This is how much NDF is just not digested. And you can see the alfalfa was actually a little higher. Starch content was pretty similar, 27 versus 29%. Okay, so what did he see in milk production when he compared this alfalfa silage versus the orchard grass silage? He actually observed numerically there's some slight differences, and I'm sorry I've got these units in kilograms per day. But actually, he observed that the NDF constant or the dry matter intake, milk yield, fat corrected milk, and fat and protein cows actually behave the same whether they were consuming alfalfa or orchard grass. Okay, did observe actually quite a large difference in total track NDF digestibility, where alfalfa resulted that alfalfa diet had higher total NDF digestibility. But what differences can actually occur in the animals? This is another measure. Obviously, it's not something that you see in the bulk tank, but I really believe it's real when you compare these two forages and the feedability of these two forages. He looked at passage rate. And so if he looked at what he did is he looked at the passage rate of indigestible NDF particles or potentially digestible NDF particles, which are in black. Whichever case, whichever particles you are looking at, you can see that the passage rate for the alfalfa particles was quite a bit more rapid than the orchard grass. Okay, so what does this mean? And again, he was interested in this whole concept of fragility. And so his suggestion is that maybe the alfalfa particles break down a little more rapidly and extensively than the orchard grass. And this is one reason why you actually see some fairly large differences in passage rate. And so you can think if you're trying to make some dietary changes, trying to improve rumen digestibility, this passage rate could move out particles that you're trying to get digested more extensively. Okay, so what about this whole notion? Some of your nutritionists may be looking at something called UNDF or undigestible NDF. Okay, and so basically what this is you put a sample in an in vitro incubation, and you leave it in there for 240 hours. Okay, and it's usually used as a measure that's related to dry matter intake. So what was the UNDF, the UNDF of these two forages? The alfalfa, the UNDF was 23%. The orchard grass was 16%. And so his suggestion is that this whole relationship between dry matter intake and UNDF 240, although there's probably something to be said for it, it really doesn't hold between these two forages within a forage family. And so he recommended, if people are going to use this UNDF measure, that they should really stick within the forage family, and that these implications don't really draw out when you try to make these comparisons across forage families. So this whole idea of forage fragility, it certainly may affect dry matter intake. And so what we have listed here is the NDF or the dry matter intake prediction equation that's used in the dairy NASEM. And so people may say, well, why do I need to predict dry matter intake of the diets? The reason why that's important is that your nutritionist, number one, may use that as a starting point. If they haven't worked with you in a long time or ever, they may use that as a starting point to understand just how to formulate those diets. But then you may start to track changes in the diets themselves and trying to anticipate what those changes in the diets will do to dry matter intake are important. And so this equation that's listed in the dairy NASEM does include some of these factors that can influence dry matter intake. Okay. The first one is forage NDF content, which is included in this equation. And then the fragility of the forage. And the fragility of the forage is factored in by the NDF content, but also that ratio of ADF to NDF. And these are just some measures of how this ratio of ADF to NDF can vary between different forage types. The other thing that's included in this equation is NDF digestibility. We know that as NDF digestibility increases, you can often see increases in dry matter intake, or the opposite, decrease in NDF digestibility may have negative effects on dry matter intake. Okay. One of the things that was noted by the committee is this equation was essentially developed in cows in kind of late, mid to late lactation. So the equation really isn't applicable to cows in super early lactation. So why is this equation useful? I think as you're looking at maybe different forages or maybe even different years of the forage, trying to anticipate how some of these constituents that are largely forage-based can affect dry matter intake are important. So talking about forage intake, we've kind of covered the impact on chemical composition. But what I want to do is take some time talking about how forage quality, specifically related to alfalfa, can actually influence the preference of those animals to these ingredients. I'm going to show you some fairly simple studies that we use to examine feed preference, and these have been kind of fun studies to do. They're fairly low maintenance, but they are important. Why is feed preferences important? Well, for I think maybe two reasons that we're particularly interested in it. Feed preference of individual ingredients can affect dry matter intake of a TMR. So as you can see, this equation to predict dry matter intake doesn't include this kind of fuzzy notion of palatability. But we know palatability and feed preference can indeed affect dry matter intake. The other one is as people are using automatic milking systems and using a supplement in the robot to entice that animal to go to the robot. I think it's particularly important that we understand maybe feed factors that could influence preference. And I'll show you a second study in a second here that we kind of tried to evaluate preference of a feed ingredient or a feed supplement that may or may not go into a robot. The first one I want to show you is just the importance of forage quality on feed preference. And I know sometimes we use a feed that maybe we're stuck with if it's the only feed. But I just want to show you how important forage quality is, not only for the chemical composition and digestibility, but even feed preference. And so what we did is we took, this is actually a picture of cows at the University of Nebraska where we use Jersey cows. What we did is we fed 4 treatments. We fed a low relative feed value alfalfa, a high relative feed value alfalfa, and then kind of maybe what many people would call as a crappy brome hay, and then a medium relative feed value alfalfa. So what did we do? This is how the RFVs broke out. The high had a 213, the mid had 163, and the low had a 94 RFV. And then, of course, the brome hay was the lowest of those. Okay. And what we did is this is a common method we do to evaluate feed preference. We basically run this study over 9 days. And so the first day, we'll offer all 4 of the feeds and observe. We put these feeds in kind of small amounts, but we put them in these containers and just observe the behavior of these animals. Okay. And after 4 days, it's pretty easy. That feed is offered in front of them for basically 10 minutes or so. And we observe which animals actually identified the most preferred feed. And then after 5 days, we'll remove the next preferred feed. So it doesn't really take long for us to understand, okay, well, which feeds are animals going to consume? And then we just go down the road and we start removing the feeds which they really like until there's a comparison of the last two. Okay. And ultimately, what we're able to do is look at a ranking. And so this is what we observed in this study. Again, maybe not a surprise, but just driving home the point of why high quality forages are needed. And you can see that what I've got listed here is a mean rank. So the lower number in the rank is the better. And then the probability of this feed being chosen first. So these numbers are basically mirrors of each other, or the responses are. And so no surprise probably to anybody on the call, but the high RFB feed was most preferred. And it was just as we'd expect. The medium is a mid-range, and then the low, and with the brome being the least. Okay. Again, I'm not showing anything that this group doesn't know, but I think this just really shows us if we are trying to drive intake, it's not just about chemical composition and digestibility, but it's about the aroma, the quality of that feed, and how they sense it as well. And that's going to drive this preference is going to be a driver in dry matter intake. And this is not something that is in our intake equations to predict. Okay. So this was also kind of a fun study. We did, again, the same concept. But actually, a group of students and I went to a robotic dairy, and we were talking to the producer about their grain mixes. And I won't talk specifically about what they saw, but they were asking some very general questions about how that grain mix was formulated and how it could be affecting feed visits, because feed visits was something they were a little bit disappointed in. And to my knowledge, there really is kind of limited research out there looking at feed preference. And so we thought we'd put kind of a twist on this by also looking at forages as well, or at least alfalfa. So what we did, just like the other study, we fed 4 treatments. We fed basically dehydrated alfalfa meal with rolled corn, and we made that into a pellet. Okay. And then there was a little bit of wheat middlings in that as well. So basically high alfalfa, high corn with some wheat middlings. Then what we call, this is the energy treatment. So basically a lot of corn, a lot of distillers grains, and a little bit of wheat middlings. And I should mention these numbers represent the percent of the ingredient dry matter. Okay, so this ingredient this pellet had 72% ground corn in it. And we also had 100% alfalfa meal treatment as well. So just alfalfa going in there. And then something we called the grain mix. So there was no alfalfa going in there. It was just dried corn, distillers grains, wheat middlings, soybean meal, molasses, corn oil. And then we also put in several other ingredients. Off the top of my head, I can't even remember what they were. I do remember one of the things that was in there was the vitamin and mineral trace, the vitamin and mineral mixes as well. Okay. So, as you're sitting there, I'd be curious to know at least what your hypothesis was on dry matter intake. But this was actually a treatment that wasn't driving robot intakes. And so this is something that we wanted to evaluate, is the preference of these pellets. Well, in our study, what we observed, again, the first row is rank, with the lowest number being the most preferred feed ingredient. And what we saw was indeed this alfalfa. So just to remember, the alfalfa meal, corn, wheat middling pellet was actually most preferred. Okay. The next one is what we call this energy pellet. That energy pellet had rolled corn, distiller's grains, and wheat middlings. Okay. Then the D-high alfalfa pellet actually was the least preferred. And then this grain mix was all the second least preferred. The other thing that I should just mention is this was a pellet not only at the with the producer, but what we were doing was one of the pellets that really stayed together the least or broke up. Okay. And so we did go back to the producer and talk to him about that pellet and trying to maybe look at the PMR, how that PMR was balanced with the grain mix, and made some recommendations based on our. You can see it matters what goes into that pellet, and there are pretty some subtle differences that can indeed influence preference. And just connecting the dots, we didn't actually measure robot visits here, but connecting the dots, it is certainly going to influence the animal's desire, ability, and maybe drive to get up, work, and go to that AMS to consume that feed. So, and this is an area, these are simple studies, but we find very interesting. And the nutrition students like formulating these diets and then measuring cow behavior on those diets or those pellets that they formulated. Okay, think think many of you know that here at University of Nebraska, we've done a lot of research over the last 20 years on corn co-products. And so this was a study that we conducted several years ago, looking at feeding distillers grains. And so one of the things that we would hear is, well, distillers grains don't fit well in our diets because we feed a lot of ingredient X. Okay, that ingredient X was often a different forage type. And so if people fed a lot of alfalfa haylage, we would commonly hear, okay, well, we don't need that protein from distillers grains. Distillers grains don't work in our diet. So what we did is we formulated 4 different diets. They differed by the amount of corn silage that was in them, and then by the amount of either distillers grains or an expeller soy. And this was a simple substitution. So just breaking up these 4 diets, these 2 on the left are high in corn silage. About 39% of the diet dry matter is corn silage. And then on the what we call the alfalfa haylage diet, about 18% is alfalfa haylage here. Okay. And then obviously what differed is the amount of the distiller's grains. It was either 10% of the diet dry matter or 0%. And when it was 0%, we added the expeller soy. We did a very similar substitution, although it wasn't quite as much on the alfalfa haylage diets. Okay. So does forage type or forage proportion affect how the animals are going to respond by the inclusion of either distiller's grains or expeller soy? So what we observed, again, these 4 diets, what we've got listed here is dry matter intake, milk yield, and energy corrected milk. I don't have fat, but that followed very similar circumstances as these first 3 variables. What we saw, and again, these were Jersey animals, that dry matter intake was not affected. It was just under 20 kilograms per day across the board for all 4 of these diets. And as a result, milk yield was pretty similar. We calculated energy corrected milk. Statistically, that wasn't different. But if we did look at milk protein, this is where these diets actually did kind of come apart. Okay. But they didn't come apart in the inclusion of distillers grains. They did come apart in the inclusion of that forage type. And what we see here is maybe the reason why people are feeding a lot of corn silage is that milk protein went up both on a percent and on a yield basis if you compare it to the alfalfa haylage. And so you may ask, well, why did protein improve when you feed corn silage versus alfalfa haylage? And largely that's driven by the energy content of the diets. And so if you see these diets, maybe in corn silage are a little higher in energy, we think that maybe the rumen results in greater fermentation and fermentability, and we get a greater growth of rumen microorganisms, and those microorganisms supply amino acids to the animals. So we see this difference in milk protein percent. If we look at yield, there's that trend there, but it was actually not as significant. Okay, but it does seem, this is why we feed corn silage, is it is ruminally fermentable, and it probably has some positive benefits on rumen fermentation and the flow of microbial protein to support this milk protein synthesis. Okay, I'm going to show you this diet. This is just, or this study was actually done in Quebec. And what they did is they fed diets very similar alfalfa. 51% of the diet was alfalfa. 17% was corn silage. So that was the same. But what they did is they changed the grain mixture. Okay. And I've talked about NASEM. NASEM, not only, NASEM has a system where you can evaluate the diets for metabolizable protein. And so what these investigators did is change the grain mixes. So this diet on the left is, again, identical forages here, but this is deficient in metabolizable protein. And then the one on the right, positive MP, is adequate metabolizable. So these are high alfalfa diets, but the grain mixture in them is different. Where are they different? The big one is you can see cornstarch is reduced, and we see more soybean meal, and in the diet on the far right, which is positive in metabolizable protein. Okay. So what did these investigators observe? Well, when they balanced these high alfalfa diets to include a little more metabolizable protein, they did see a positive response in dry matter intake. They saw a positive response in milk yield and a positive response in energy corrected milk. Same thing, composition of the milk was higher as well. Okay, so the question is, in this case, what's really different in this metabolizable protein? The NASEM does give us an ability to look at individual amino acids. And in these diets, the methionine was very similar. The lysine was very similar. One of the things that was different was, and again, this isn't because of the forages were the same. It was the feed ingredients. Okay. Isoleucine was different. And this, you have to be careful with this efficiency. This efficiency, the higher it is, the lower the supply is. So it's a little tricky to think about. But what this diet is showing is that this diet is actually probably low. Maybe some would say deficient in the amino acid isoleucine. And so this isn't an amino acid we think a lot about. We often think of methionine and lysine, but this isoleucine one is starting to get some interest as well. And so as we feed these different feeds, certainly it's important to understand the amino acid supply. So why was that diet low in isoleucine? One of the reasons is it was actually pretty high in blood meal, and blood meal actually has a low concentration of isoleucine. So I guess I'm showing this to you to tell you that, certainly if you look at changing the forages and as you formulate those grain mixes, it can have influences on milk production, not just on methionine and lysine, but potentially other amino acids that we're starting to look at. Okay. The next thing I want to do is talk about lignin and alfalfa. This was a study that was conducted at University of Wisconsin. And what they did is they published this study in Applied Animal Science, looking at low lignin alfalfa. And this was actually fed to steers. And so many of you know these low lignin alfalfa. There's two commercial forms out there, and these are listed here. And so in this study, what they did is they planted these alfalfas, and then they compared them. So it was a control alfalfa. I can't exactly remember what that control was. And then these two low lignin alfalfas. And so what was the composition of these forages? The crude protein content was a little higher on the low lignin alfalfas. And then the NDF content was fairly similar, but maybe highest in this middle treatment. And then the acid detergent lignin, or the lignin content, was quite a bit lower on this alfalfa on the far right. And then the highest acid detergent lignin was observed on this control. I should mention these units are um, uh, grams per kilogram. So if you want to move it to percent, just move the decimal over one place. So this 178 is actually 17.8% of that feed. Okay. Acid detergent lignin would be 7.56. Okay. The lowest lignin was observed here. Okay. So the idea is lignin is known to negatively affect digestibility. And the hypothesis was these two forages that were bred to contain lower lignin would result in improved production because of the digestibility. What I have listed here also is the relative feed value of these feeds, and then the book values for NEM and NEG. Okay. So what did they observe? This is just intake in grams per kilogram, and then the p-value on the far right. And so the intake of these forages were the same. Okay. And then they also looked at in vitro NDF digestibility. Okay. They looked at it at 24, 30, and 40 hours. Okay. I just want to focus on the 48-hour, and you can see that the highest 48-hour NDF digestibility was observed on this low lignin alfalfa to the far right. Intermediate was the middle one, and then the lowest 48-hour NDF digestibility was observed here. Okay. So what did they observe in terms of production when they fed these two alfalfas? Again, NDF digestibility increased as you go from left to right. Okay. And so they did observe a difference in dry matter intake. Dry matter intake tended to increase on these two low lignin alfalfa. But then when they looked at this individual body weight, obviously by study design, it was the same. And then when they looked at final body weight, although there was a numerical increase, statistically, there was no difference. And if you looked at average daily gain, again, numerically a difference, but statistically, there was no difference. Okay. And then if you looked at the dry matter intake of just the alfalfa, again, was the same across treatments. And then gain efficiency. And if you looked at gain efficiency, again, maybe a numerical trend, but statistically, there was nothing there. So definitely these lignin did have an effect on the digestibility of these forages, but the performance in these animals was not observed to be statistically different, even though maybe there were some numerical differences. Okay, the next thing I want to do is talk about a study that we conducted at the University of Nebraska looking at low lignin alfalfas. And so there's basically two low lignin alfalfas out there. What we did is we combined the two of them together into a test forage. And so what I have listed here are the three forages that we fed in our study. The first is kind of a garden variety corn silage, and I've got the chemical composition listed here. And then a control, or basically a run-of-the-mill alfalfa. Chemical composition is listed here, so 20.5% crude protein, 42% NDF, 6.8% lignin. Okay. And then we have this test, and again, that's a combination of two commercially available but different low lignin alfalfas. And when we look at the chemical composition of these, crude protein was 19.8, NDF 39.9, and then lignin was lower, 6.08, but not a lot lower, but it was different. And I show this because this maybe could explain some of the differences we see. Okay, so these are the diets that we fed, and what we did is we titrated this test alfalfa, the low lignin alfalfa, through treatments. Okay, so all diets had the same amount of corn silage here, and then we had the greatest proportion of the control alfalfa in the control treatment, and then reduced that from 32% of the diet dry matter to 16 to none or 0%. And then we titrated up this test alfalfa mix. Okay. So ultimately, if you compare this control and the mix high, the big difference is this contains no low lignin alfalfa, and all control. And then what on the right, obviously, is all low lignin alfalfa, and then none of the control. Okay. All of these diets had a similar amount of ground corn and then concentrated. So this is a dairy study. I've shown you a beef study already. This is what we saw in digestibility. And we didn't match with our hypothesis. We thought that low lignin alfalfa would have greater NDF digestibility, maybe other nutrients as well, if we think that NDF digestibility can improve digestion of other nutrients. But this is a slide just showing in our study, we did not observe any differences specifically in NDF digestibility when we fed that low lignin alfalfa, or when we titrated it up from 0 to 16 to 32% of the diet dry matter. NDF digestibility was right around 50% digestible. What did we observe in production? So what we actually observed generally was not what we hypothesized. We kind of thought digestibility would improve and we would see increases in production. In our case, dry matter intake was the same, and we tested linear or quadratic contrast. And so dry matter intake was the same. Numerically, there was maybe some differences. Numerically, this was the highest, this low mix alfalfa, but there was no numerical differences, no differences in energy corrected milk. What we did see is maybe a trend for increased feed efficiency when we fed low lignin alfalfa. And so that is in part kind of a function between some of these numbers moving in tandem, both dry matter intake and milk yield. But we did see this is the one positive response that we saw in our study is perhaps an improvement in feed efficiency when we fed that low lignin alfalfa. When we went on to to milk composition on fat and protein, there were no differences observed in that treatment. Should mention, don't actually have the page numbers listed here, but this study that I'm talking about, the low lignin alfalfa study in dairy cattle, was published in the Journal of Dairy Science in 2024. And the graduate student that did all the hard work was Cassidy Buse, and I have her listed here as the author. So maybe just to summarize, we're basically at the end of the presentation. This is a summary. I mean, I think alfalfa has many positive agronomic advantages, and I'd encourage you, if you're a producer, to think about that. And if you're advising producers, not to forget alfalfa because of some of these reasons. I didn't talk a lot about protein. That protein in alfalfa is highly soluble and digestible in the rumen. And in cases where we have all of these byproducts that are available, distillers grains and gluten feed that already have protein, this is probably one reason why alfalfa has fallen out of favor. But it certainly is highly digestible protein. Compared to corn silage, understandably, alfalfa does supply less energy. And dry matter intake is also lower because of the lower milk production. Okay. What about if we compare it to other forages? So if we compare it to orchard grass, is indeed more fragile. And so that physical structure can affect what happens when that cow consumes that forage. And in the case of alfalfa, this is probably one reason why dry matter intake is higher. That particle breaks down and passes through the animal quicker. Okay. And so this whole notion of fragility is not accounted for these equations that are predicting dry matter intake. And then the other one, that these equations that predict dry matter intake, another thing that's not accounted for is palatability, and trying to understand the quality of that alfalfa matters, and maybe what else is fed in that grain mix can affect palatability. And this is something that's not on nutritionist computer screen. And it's so easy to forget about just how that animal perceives that feed and how that can drive not only intake production, but if you're looking at AMS units, the drive of that animal may have to go to the robot. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions the group may have. Oh, I see we gained a few more participants as we went along. That's great.
Yep.
I want to. I just first I want to thank Fred and the group for the invitation for me to share some of this information today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kononoff. I would say we're a fairly small group. If you want to go ahead and unmute and ask the question directly, we'll give just a couple of seconds. I see Mike unmuted, so let's see what the questions are.
Yes, I have a question for Paul. This is Mike Hutchins, and that is, what about the new grasses? The meadow fescues, for example. Orchard grass is one of the, what I would tend, an older type grass there. Well, will these other grasses look better than orchard grass? The meadow fescue and
Oh,
those kinds of grasses?
yeah. Mike, nice to hear your voice and great to interact with you. Um, you're right. I mean, I think there's a lot of these grasses that are interesting to look at. We're still learning about them. I think I think really what you're asking is, well, if you're asking about fragility, I do think this relationship between ADF and NDF holds across forages. And so, because that is a measure of hemicellulose. And so I do think, if we do, first of all, we need to find a better way to physically measure fragility. But it does look like this gross estimate of fragility by looking at the ratio of ADF to NDF probably does hold across forages, but we need probably some more research to really fully understand that.
Very good. Dale, you have a question? That's right. His mic may not be working well. So if he doesn't type it, we probably won't see it. In your discussions, did you find differences between baled and in silage alfalfa and your passage rates?
Yeah, good question. So the type of forage. So we just because of the way we set up our studies, we usually choose either silage or hay or one or the other. We actually haven't compared the two. I'm just trying to think. I think generally, we assume, at least when we're looking at the fragility of the forage, the hay is more fragile than the alfalfa. In terms of digestibility, I mean, one of the things that obviously harvest conditions can really influence that as well.
Yep. Okay, I'll give a second or two. If folks want to unmute and ask the question, they go ahead and do that.
Yeah, I'll ask another question. Paul, where are you putting UNDF 240 in terms of target numbers in the total ration dry matter?
Um,
I see some nutritionists are using that, to sweet.
mhm. Yeah, Mike, uh, it's a good question. I'm not going to provide target numbers. I think, with the work that Mike Allen did, What I think is important is, if nutritionists are working with different forages, when you are making those influences or those changes on a farm, just beware that forage family may have an effect. So, I wish I could give you recommendations. I know if you look, Mike Van Amberg's got some recommendations out there, but those aren't recommendations that I generally give. And I think what Mike Allen would say is be careful, because if you're feeding different forages, those target points may differ depending on the forage. I know that's a totally political question, but if you talk to Mike Allen, that would be his concern with some of those benchmark UNDF numbers and recommendations.
Very good. We've got a question from Dale Thorson. Uh, Lots of southern rust in Iowa this year in the corn. Any thoughts on how that
Mm,
might affect digestibility?
uh, it's a good question. Uh, Dale, that's just not an area that I'm an expert in. I know that can, depending on the time of year and the growth, I don't even want to, I'd love to give some thoughts there, but I just feel like that's outside of my expertise. I know it's not well tested as well. This is one of the, big limitations in forage science, is looking at environmental conditions and that impact on digestibility and forage quality.
Thank you. And I might suggest that if folks are interested, 2 months ago, we did a program with a researcher out of Florida who had done a lot of work with southern rust, and he had some interesting comments to make on that. So I would say go back in our archives. Daryl asks the question, does looking at NDF digestibility at a lower hour, like 12 hours, provide a better comparison between alfalfa haylage and corn silage or grass silage than the 30-hour or the 240?
So, I mean, I think again, unfortunately, this is an area that we have limited research, but Daryl's suggestion was, well, with alfalfa, should we look at an earlier time point to compare forage quality? And this suggestion was to make me look at the 12-hour. And Daryl, I think you're right. And I'm going to just connect the dots, maybe without a lot of research there. You think about alfalfa being fragile and passing out of the rumen quickly. And we want to know, okay, is that a feed that's going to digest quickly? Because it's not around for all that long. Yeah, maybe we should look at that earlier time point for alfalfa. So I'd agree with you.
Thank you. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit. You've talked a lot about the dairy side. Would you predict a difference if feeding beef on dairy steers in the final feedlot period as far as the inclusion of an alfalfa?
Mm. So I really should defer to my colleagues that feed beef cattle. Guess what I see is um, number one, they're not feeding a high value alfalfa. And, if they are feeding alfalfa, it's for effective fiber. They're not feeding it for energy or digestibility. And so I don't know if and because they're feeding such small amounts, I guess my hunch was, and that's what that study showed, is that, in that study, although they fed much more, those animals actually didn't respond to the higher value or higher quality alfalfa. And I suspect in the real world, that's probably the case as well in those high finishing diets. So I don't think they'd be sensitive to it.
Very good. Uh, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. I'll pose one more. Would you see any difference, or have you ever looked at any differences in heifer versus cow herd issues, heifer performance growth? We talked about cow production, but do you suspect that there's a difference?
So a difference in, if you were to feed, I guess, what would be heifer versus cow, number one, are you talking about first lactation heifers or growing heifers? And then what's the difference in nutrition you want me to remark on?
In visiting with the folks from New York, they seem to predict heifer performance is improved with grass versus corn
Mm,
silage. And I just was
mm,
curious if you'd done any studies that would
yeah,
look at
yeah,
the growing heifer performance.
yeah. So that one, I guess I wouldn't. I can tell you, we haven't done studies on that, and we certainly haven't compared those two forages. I do know there's a lot of interest in knowing what is the best forage for that. I know, yeah, I should maybe stop there. And
Okay.
yeah,
Not seeing any more questions. I'd thank you, Paul, for sharing this information and your insights and strategy for using alfalfa in
yeah.
dairy rations. This program has been recorded and will be available on the Four State Extension Dairy Group website. Give us 5 to 7 working days to get it up. In addition, I will email you when it is available, as well as including the link to the program evaluation. Thank you for your participation, and I look forward to seeing you at next month's webinar. I'll conclude by wishing everyone a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. At this point, I will close the session. Thank you very much, Dr. Kononoff.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, everyone. Merry Christmas.